The 57-inch Samsung Odyssey G9 has been pretty tough to beat as my all-time favourite monitor, even 2 years after it went on sale. The 40-inch Dell monitor that I reviewed last year came very close to beating that, but for different reasons. But as soon as I saw the 52-inch Dell UltraSharp Thunderbolt monitor, I just had to instantly buy one and just scratch that itch to see whether this might just be the best all-round monitor for 2026 and finally claim its permanent place on my desk. Now, this isn't a sponsored review. Dell isn't paying me to make this video. And yes, I spent £2,560 of my own money to buy one of these monitors, and we're going to put it through its paces in what I hope to be one of the most in-depth reviews of this monitor on YouTube. And if you are into that sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel. Like 95% of people watching aren't subscribed, and I hate asking, but every time I do ask, more people subscribe. I'm also going to link to this monitor down below in the description, so if you do plan on buying one, it costs you absolutely nothing, and it really helps to support this channel and helps us to make more videos like these. And I legit plan on keeping this monitor for the foreseeable future, so if you do have any questions, then I will be trying to respond to each and every question in the comments, which, as the channel is growing, it gets quite challenging, but I will definitely give it my best shot. Starting off with the unboxing experience, which, we are really getting into more of a TV unboxing experience at this size. The box is absolutely ginormous, and whilst it is very possible to do this with one person, especially if you are using the included stand, I would still recommend two just to be safe. So you get a power cable, a 1.8 meter DisplayPort cable and HDMI 2.1 cable, a 2 meter Thunderbolt 4 cable, and a 1 meter USB-A to C cable. Now, I would say that if you plan to cable manage these cables through something like a monitor arm, I'm a huge fan of the Secret Lab monitor arm, which just fits this monitor just fine, then you probably want to look at some longer cables with many of these, especially those USB-A to C cables, which are needed for the KVM features to connect, your various machines to the monitor, which I would say are dangerously short, and only one comes included in the box. Speaking of which, the only confusing part of unboxing this was if you are planning to mount this monitor onto a monitor arm. The instructions seem to say that you need to attach some sort of plates onto the back of the monitor, which, for the life of me, we just couldn't find included in the box. We just came to the conclusion that this comes as part of the Dell branded monitor arm instead. So for now, we just mounted the monitor directly to the VESA mount plate, and it works just fine. Although, depending on your own mount, you might need some little standoffs to give yourself that, little bit more room to mount them. But let's get on to the specs now, because this is an absolute beast in terms of specs. So it is a 52-inch, 6K, 120Hz refresh rate, 4200R IPS black curved monitor with a Thunderbolt dock included in the back. And that gives you a 2.5 gig Ethernet port, 140 watt power delivery for charging a laptop, and just a plethora of other features such as KVM for up to 4 different sources, and includes a handy little pop-out tray to connect and charge other USB devices. Really, the only spec I can argue with here is the response time of 8 milliseconds in normal mode and 5 milliseconds in fast mode. But when this isn't really a gaming monitor per se, well, I'll get onto that a little bit later when we actually do benchmark some games. The other thing that I am not a huge fan of is that even though this is a curved monitor, it is barely curved. It's even shallower than the 40-inch monitor at just 4200R. And from sitting in front of one, it basically looks flat. And I know there is definitely personal preference involved with, whether you like a curve or not. But when we are talking about larger and larger monitors, especially ones designed for you to, sit directly in front of, a deeper curve would make a lot more sense. Now, as it stands, it's not bad by any stretch, but I do find the reflections a little bit distracting at times, depending on the angle and how bright the environment around me is. But with that said, this monitor does have an anti-glare coating, but Dell have gone for a much lighter coating to avoid affecting the color reproduction of this monitor, as it is predominantly marketed at professional use, where color accuracy is more important. And honestly, I'm not really sure how to show this off best on camera. If you do have any tips, then I'd love to hear, but it's not a glossy screen for those who care, but it is also a very light matte coating lighting. Now, one thing that definitely helped with those light glares though was disabling the auto brightness, which I found quite aggressive out of the box. The light sensor is actually on top, which makes sense, but obviously if you have, say, a bright light shining on that, or maybe even something like a light bar, then that will cause problems and just set it off all over the place. Now, once I've disabled this and set it to around about 75 to 80%, I found it much more comfortable to use. Although it does warn you a lot. Are you sure you want to disable automatic dimming? Adjusting the value will increase power consumption. Do you want to continue? Now, with that said, one issue we came across on our specific monitor was noticing a pretty big difference in brightness across the whole panel. Now, the sweet spot was, of course, the center, where we saw roughly 380 nits, slightly less than the advertised 400 nits, but again, within kind of tolerance. But then move outside of that, and the numbers start dropping pretty quickly. From the left and right sides, we saw one side stay pretty consistent and dropping only a few nits, but then the other side saw it dropping much further. Now, I'm not sure if this is just my own screen that has these issues, and I would definitely be interested to hear from anyone else who bought this monitor to see if they also see the same thing. Maybe let me know down in the comments down below. But generally speaking, this monitor does great in all kind of day-to-day and just typical office or home office situations. No concern over brightness. Like I said, I found like 70 to 80% was pretty comfortable to use in our relatively bright studio, lots of windows, lots of lights. So just, yeah, no concerns there whatsoever. Now, one area where Dell really hasn't slouched on though is the design here. I love this super clean design. It's not trying to be anything but sleek with this, metallic, like off-white color on the back. Easy access to all of the many ports available with the simple quick release stand system, which does come with some basic cable management. Unfortunately, there's no way of hiding all of the cables with this stand, but from the front, everything looks symmetrical, and even bezel, aside from the bottom ever so slightly being thicker just to make room for that Dell logo. And I really do love this kind of design so much. There's no bold design with like tons of vents and lines and curves, which just means, if you are the type who wants to jazz up your desk with some lighting, you can mount that to the back because there is just tons of space to do that. Now, there is no panel to hide any of the wiring though, which might have been nice, but as long as you do a good job at hiding the cables, then that's normally, not a huge problem. And you've also got easy access to the screen controls on the back right-hand side of the screen. Again, there's a really clean interface here. There's no messing around with these like slower smart interfaces that most modern monitors are going for with, live TV and Xbox game streaming, which basically just result in an overall bad experience where you just be much better off hooking up an external device like an Xbox or an Apple TV or something, which aren't then horrendously laggy. And whilst there isn't any included remote control, those on-screen controls are practically endless. There is quick access to everything you need. You can set custom shortcuts to your most used features, brightness, screen controls, a ton of picture-by-picture options, and more on that in just a moment. There is even support for DDC-CI, so you can adjust many of the screen settings from within software, so you don't even have to touch the controls. You can also easily assign USB inputs when switching between devices, enable or disable charging when the monitor is powered off, although take a look at these three options. I don't really understand, are they the same? I'm not too sure here. Anyway, like I said, there are an absolute truckload of picture-by-picture modes. There's color profiles. It's just customizable with seemingly everything anyone would ever need as far as the settings menu goes. Dell just absolutely smashed it out of the park when it comes to options in the OSD menu this year. Nice. The stand itself, it's okay. Like I said, with some basic cable management and with a footprint that's not huge, and causes, issues with intruding on the rest of your desk with those old, diagonal legs we used to see. But I do wish is a little bit more lower profile, given the fact a 65-inch LG TV has a lower profile than this Dell stand does. Which is, of course, one reason I am a huge fan of using a monitor arm to reclaim the space underneath your screen. You can change the height, the tilt and swivel, but no pivots, so it's no Samsung Arc or anything like that. But yeah, it's okay. Now, the absolute chef's kiss of perfection when it comes to this monitor, though, is the connectivity. Now, I don't normally use the word plethora, but this thing has absolutely got it. It has a 140-watt Thunderbolt 4 upstream ports, 2 HDMI 2.1 ports, 2 DisplayPort 1.4 ports, 3 USB-C 10 gigabit ports, which are used as uplinks for the KVM features, 4 10 gig USB Type A ports to hook up all your accessories and keyboards and mice and everything, a 2.5 gig Ethernet port, plus there are a further 2 10 gigabit USB-C ports with 27 watt power delivery, and 1 USB Type A port tucked away in this handy little drop-down area. It is just an absolute powerhouse when it comes to ports. And that's because, being a Thunderbolt monitor, it is a full-blown docking station built in with like KVM to switch between these devices, between different machines, with the only real challenge being like, how the heck do you cable manage all of those connected devices? Because that is quite something. Also, one feature I'm thankful this screen doesn't have in it is AI. Leave that for Claude or Gemini or whichever you prefer, because AI can be super helpful with other tasks like research and writing, and that's where Merlin AI comes in. Instead of using multiple tools, Merlin AI brings the best AI models together in one place. ChatGPT for writing, Claude for reasoning, and Gemini for research. You get the right model for the right task, all inside a single platform while saving a lot of money. They actually gave us a 75% discount code, which we will share with you in just a second. Now, you might already be using AI to rewrite emails or to figure out what it really means when your ex texts you at 1 a.m. But Merlin goes beyond that. In our work, it helps us with research, summarizing spec sheets, and pulling reference images in one click. And once installed, it's like a competent assistant in your browser. So if you want to try Merlin AI, you can get a huge discount right now. While other AI tools charge around about $20 per month for just one model, Merlin AI gives access to all major ones for only $5 per month. Now, they can do this because they purchase API credits in bulk from all the top LLM providers. So click on the link in the description below and use our code PETE5 at checkout, or scan the QR code. Now, resolution-wise, this screen runs at a huge 6144 by 2560. It's not officially quite 6K, but it's close enough for them to call it 6K. And this is running at 129 pixels per inch, which again is technically lower than both the 57-inch Samsung G9 and the previous 40-inch Dell Thunderbolt monitor. But compared to the 57-inch G9, you are losing some of the width, but you are gaining the vertical resolution here. And even though Dell seems to really be targeting like stock traders, where you'll have just screens full of charts and data, well, that also has benefits for the rest of us, especially someone like me who likes having this just insanely ridiculous number of windows open at once. More on like Mac and Windows in a moment, but you can very comfortably split the screen into 4 or more spaces to feel productive. And I've said this before when comparing the 57-inch G9 to the 40-inch Dell, and even though they were the same pixels per inch, the Dell definitely looked better to my eyes. And the same thing here applies with the 52-inch Dell. I still think the image quality looks better than the 57-inch G9. Now, in terms of text fringing, here is a comparison between the 57-inch G9, 40-inch Dell, and the 52-inch Dell, just so you can see the differences. Now, this will likely be to do with the G9's Quantum Mini LED versus the Dell IPS Black panel, but it is really good, so no real issues at all for productivity. I think Dell really does nail like the picture quality on their monitors, even if most people disregard them for, other more gamery options like LG or maybe Samsung. Now, no, we're not getting anywhere near like Retina PPI levels just yet, but this is, still a nice resolution, nice PPI, just overall everything nice. Also, 120Hz refresh rate with support for variable refresh rate, which, again, for most people, productivity first, gaming second, is ideal. I definitely find 120Hz makes a big difference even on productivity, just like moving windows around feels a whole lot smoother. So if you are going from a 50 or 60Hz panel to this, it will be a dramatic improvement. Those that are coming from a 240Hz panel, obviously that might be a noticeable downgrade, so to speak, but at least on the Samsung G9 57-inch model, I could never get 240Hz working with a Mac, so there's that. Now, in terms of color accuracy, this is where the Dell really shines over other more consumer and more gaming-focused monitors. So here we have 99% DCI P3 and display P3 coverage, and 100% sRGB and BT709, which was accurate as far as our tests go. Now, you can also use Dell's own software to calibrate and adjust those settings, and combined with the 6K resolution, it is just good to know that you're getting a great overall experience, and one that is definitely aimed at the more professional market, for graphics and for video and just anything that requires accurate colors. You can, of course, calibrate with lots of third-party tools and hardware as well, so there's always that. But generally speaking, colors are rich, and the black levels make use of the newer IPS black technology, which gives you an increased 2000:1 contrast ratio, which is double that of, most standard IPS panels, although it is less than OLED and Quantum Mini LED, like on my favorite G9 models. But again, without getting mixed up with all the IPS versus OLED versus all the other technologies, I actually made a whole other video about picking the best monitor specifically for productivity, which I'll link to at the end of this video and in the description down below. But generally speaking, buy this. It's freaking amazing. But for those interested in the screen, I've been sat in front of it for long enough now to know that it has better image quality than my 57-inch G9, plus it just fixes the biggest frustration with the 40-inch Dell Thunderbolt after coming from the 57-inch G9, plus also fixes the biggest frustration with me for the G9 with that vast amount of bloom that happens around lots of kind of black and white kind of sharp edges. And although that doesn't vanish with this panel like it would on an OLED monitor, and actually I'm still waiting on that 57-inch curved OLED model, by the way, Samsung, if you can hear this, but this gets pretty damn close to being ideal. Now, with that said, there is no HDR on this model. And actually, in the last 40-inch Dell review, I said, SDR content looks great, but HDR is just a bit meh. So this year, they've opted to do a great job at SDR only, which, to their credit, does perform extremely well. I'd rather have, a great SDR monitor than one that does HDR poorly. But again, productivity first here, gaming second. But onto the most important part of using this monitor, for me, productivity. And first up, let's talk Mac, because I have the screen hooked up to both a Mac and a Windows PC, and a ton of other devices, which we'll get to. And as far as the Mac goes, as long as you make sure you install the Dell drivers and the Dell software, it has been a great experience. Now here in the studio, we have a 14-inch M4 Pro MacBook Pro, M3 Max MacBook Pro, and a 13-inch M4 MacBook Air, and none of these have any issues reaching the full native resolution. It is just so refreshing to be able to just hook up one single cable and have it charge, display, pass through all the devices which you can then hook up to the monitor. But with that said, I can't get one of the picture-by-picture modes working on a Mac where it gives you these two screens side by side with one cable, but more on that in just a moment. You do also get access to Dell's Display Manager if you want some help, like multitasking with multiple windows, which is useful at times, but on Mac, I tend to stick with my own display manager. It's called Moom, M-O-O-M, since I've just been using it for so long now that it's second nature to save and then recall where all my windows should be positioned on the screen. Having 2.5 gig Ethernet is also really welcome, since I'm currently on a MacBook Air. So for now, at least when I upload footage to our NAS here in the studio, it transfers much faster than on, the 1 gig connection that you get in most other docking stations. Now, I do wish they upped this to a 10 gig connection, but I know there's a lot to consider here: power, thermals, processing. Now we have everything here connected at 10 gig for all of our video storage footage stuff stored on our NAS. So personally, I will still need to go through my CalDigit TS5 Plus dock because that has 10 gig Ethernet. And also that just gives me a ton of extra connectivity like SD, micro SD, as well as higher resolution audio that then hooks up to my KEF LS50 Meta speakers. Which, by the way, added bonus with using this screen over the 57-inch G9, I can actually see my speakers now, because previously my Samsung monitor basically spanned the entire width of my desk. And so I then have to put, or rather hide, my KEF speakers almost behind the screen. But back to the Dell, because it is a Thunderbolt 4 display, there are zero issues to worry about with getting the full resolution, full 120Hz refresh rate, which when you compare this to a lot of other monitors, and Samsung specifically calling you out right now, who still don't include USB-C or Thunderbolt on most of their monitors, well, it can be challenging to say the least to get the full performance out of their screens as a Mac user. Now over in Windows, it's a very similar story, no issues whatsoever, and you can again use the Dell display software, or maybe use something like Fancy Zones if you prefer. It's just going to be, whatever you're used to. Now we're using a fairly top-of-the-line gaming PC here, to be fair. We will get into some rough FPS tests in some games at the 6K native resolution in a moment, but I'm able to get the full native resolution, full refresh rate without any issues. But as always, you just need to check that your system is capable of getting the best from this display. Now where this particular screen excels at though, is the picture by picture features. Like genuinely, this has so many options here. It's kind of insane. Now, at best, most monitors come with a picture by picture mode where you can place, two sources side by side, or picture in picture where you have one main display and then like a tiny window displaying inside that window. With the Dell 52-inch Thunderbolt monitor, you can display up to 4 different sources through any combination of the 2 HDMIs, 2 DisplayPorts, and 1 Thunderbolt. And all in all, about 40 different combinations of like window arrangements. So with this 52-inch Dell Thunderbolt monitor, there are essentially 3 options here. Now, the first is your traditional picture-in-picture and picture-by-picture mode. Then you have screen partitioning, which works with DisplayPort and Thunderbolt devices only. And then finally, picture-by-picture with screen partitioning, which also then only works with DisplayPort and Thunderbolt devices only. So let's take these one by one, starting off with picture-in-picture and picture-by-picture modes. Now, this is your more traditional setting to display anything from 2 to 4 different sources at once, and by using the OSD, you can choose from 23 different pre-configured layouts. With that layout configured, you can then dial in which sources you want to display in each area, and then decide which screen you want to hook up to take over the connected USB devices, because you can only connect the USB devices to one computer at a time. However, you can also enable the auto KVM feature, and after you install the display Dell software on each of those 4 devices, you can have that switch between those devices like automagically. However, not if you use a Mac. I love how Dell's website says in huge letters, works seamlessly with devices on Mac OS, asterisk. Based on internal testing of Dell's monitors connected to devices on Mac OS via Thunderbolt, June 2024, some features may not be supported. And yeah, it just doesn't work at all. But anyway, once you have those devices configured, you can then play around with your resolutions and refresh rates, which can be a bit of a mixed bag depending on the devices you're using. Now, with 2 devices, I get a resolution of 3072 by 2560 at 120 Hz on both displays. With 4 devices, I get a resolution of 3072 by 1280, all at 120 Hz. But when I tried with a mixture of Mac, PC, Xbox and PlayStation, I could only get 1080p 120Hz on the Xbox and then 1080p 60Hz on the PS5. Plus, in this mode, you can't set the aspect ratio, so both of those consoles will be ever so slightly stretched, and more on console specifically in just a moment. Now, next up, it is screen partition, which only works with Thunderbolt or DisplayPorts. And this is a really interesting mode, especially as a PC gamer. Now, this mode lets you split your screen into 15 different variants of multiple separate displays over one single cable. Now, there always used to be a bit of a trick before, which was to plug in, say, 2 HDMI cables, or, HDMI and a DisplayPort cable into one PC, both going into the same monitor, to then trick your machine into thinking that it has 2 separate displays, and then using picture by picture to show them on one display. Now, doing this has a few advantages. In Windows, for example, window management becomes easier because you can essentially move and snap windows to each monitor or virtual monitor very, very quickly and easily, instead of having, this one large space to work with and trying to work with the built-in or various other snapping tools that are available. Now, for PC gamers here, choosing the 67% and 33% window gives you a nice full 120 Hz 4K display, and then a second 2048 by 2560 display, also at 120 Hz, which is then free to run Discord or maybe keep an eye on your streaming chats or Spotify or browse or just whatever you want to run separately and just keep your eyes on. Now, if you are someone who has a separate streaming PC, you can still do this by using the regular picture mode in a picture by picture mode, in a similar way to having 2 different sources, so one for your gaming and then the second one for like your streaming PC. Pretty cool. The only problem, I guess, if you call it that, is that there is no available option to have that like 16:9 gaming display in the center with 2 slimmer windows on either side. Now, the closest you can get is a 3072 by 2560 in the middle with 2 1536 by 2560 windows either side. Although I'm sure it would be possible with a firmware update if, Dell wanted to do that, but that's the closest you can currently get. And with Mac, it's yet another thing that just doesn't seem to support the whole multiple monitors over a single cable thing. All it did for me was mirror one display multiple times, even though I have all the recommended Dell software and drivers and everything installed. And also for Matt here in the studio, all it did was tell him to please connect a supported display. So that's just 2 for 2 out of Macs here that just aren't working properly with this Dell monitor. Now, the last mode here is the picture by picture with screen partition, which allows you to display display the Thunderbolt and DisplayPort sources one above another, but also combines that clever ability to have multiple screens. Now, this mode doesn't let you choose like how big or where those windows are. You just get one PC at the top and one underneath. Each window has a 3072 by 1280 and full 120Hz refresh rate. And just like before, I had the same issue with the Mac again, just mirroring the display instead of offering a second extended display. It just doesn't seem to support the whole like multiple monitors over a single cable thing. So all in all, this is pretty extensive. Like, I haven't seen any other monitors yet offer this level of flexibility when it comes to like multiple sources, USB inputs. So honestly, just 10 out of 10 for effort here, Dell. Like, excellent work. Maybe just fix the Mac stuff though, because that's pretty crap on a brand new monitor that advertises itself as working seamlessly with Macs. Moving on. Now, on the USB side, each mode lets you toggle which source device to connect to the 4 USB-A devices on the back of the monitor. Now, the USB-C ports are the uplink ports. You have 3 uplink ports for 3 machines, and then the Thunderbolt port is used as the 4th one. And this works really well. I can hook up my audio interface, webcam, and dongles for like keyboard and mice to the screen. And then if you need to hook up any more devices, then you just need to get a USB hub to then add even more to that. Now, there is one problem that affects this 52-inch model over the previous 40-inch display that I previously reviewed, which only supported 2 devices, where you could actually essentially hardwire the 2.5 gig Ethernet port to one of your inputs. Now, for me, with my MacBook Air and my gaming PC, I always wanted to ensure my gaming PC had that 2.5 gig connection. With the 52-inch display though, you don't have that option anymore. You can either lock it to the Thunderbolt input or tie it to the KVM, which means it's tied to whichever device you choose to move the USB devices to. So you just need to be very careful here if you are transferring files, and especially with storage as well, any connected storage, because if you're doing that, as both USB devices and network devices then get lost and switched when you tell it to move it. Now, ideally, you just want to ensure each device is then directly connected to the network and not use that 2.5 gig port on the back of the screen. But otherwise, again, a huge number of ports and tons of expansion here with this display. I also love this little pop-down tray that you can tuck out of the way when not in use, and that just gives you even more options to maybe charge and connect in USB devices. It just feels like Dell have really thought about everything here. Now, my only wish, I guess, would be that those USB-A ports were USB-C ports, because, well, most of my devices are now USB-C anyways, but nowadays you can just get adapters to fix that either way. And it would have been nice to get a headphone out also, so I could wire my speakers directly to the monitor, but again, I have a USB audio interface, so that solves that one for me as well. But with all of the great things about the screen and productivity and all the good stuff, how does it fare with gaming specifically? Because I know that a lot of people will be interested in this for the IPS black panel, the resolution, 120Hz refresh rates. Now, the first thing to point out is that not many games actually natively support 6K, so instead that will bring you down to a 4K resolution, but obviously scaled up to fit on the big screen. Now, one game that does work is Battlefield 6, where I was comfortably getting around about 70 FPS in the max ultra settings with my 5090 graphics card. There's no like DLSS frame generation or any of that kind of stuff going on, which I think is pretty solid for like 6K gaming. Now, for other games, of course, performance will vary, but when you bring that down to like 4K or 1080p resolutions, some you will need to force it into a 16:9 aspect ratio, which you can do manually, or you set the screen to full auto and it should detect it, but I found myself setting it manually a few times. And like I've already spoken about before, you can use the picture by picture or screen partitioning modes if you want to game on part of your screen and then have, another area for your streaming or chat or, anything else you want to. Games consoles, though, are a bit of a weird one, though. So the Xbox Series X seems to get only 1080p at 120Hz or 1440p at 60Hz. And it basically fails or gives you a warning for everything else when you run through like the checklist, specifically telling me that my display doesn't support 4K, which it does. Whereas on the PS5, I'm getting 4K, but only 60Hz. And even loading into games, just 120Hz just doesn't ever kick in. I've just tried, different cables, different modes, and just all sorts, no change. So that's just one thing to be aware of if you are a console gamer. And for PC gaming, your performance is obviously dependent on the spec of your machine, but the PC I'm running here is a 5090 along with an Intel 149-900K. Of course, drop that resolution down to something far more manageable, 4K or under will give you that much better performance. So that's a rough idea of what you could get with like 6K gaming on this monitor. But one thing I would say here is that going from my G9 ultra wides, even the 45-inch LG Ultra Gear, which have a 0.03 millisecond response time, going to like 8 in normal mode and even 5 milliseconds in fast mode on the Dell. It is quite noticeable. And whilst the overall experience wasn't bad, I would definitely say that if you plan to do a lot of gaming on this, like, finish work for the day and then switch over to game until, early hours of the morning type gaming, then it might be worth looking at the alternatives first. Maybe that might be a reason to stick to the 57-inch G9 or perhaps get a separate gaming focus screen. But anyway, making sure we cover off all of the bases here. During regular use, productivity, gaming stuff, it stays relatively cool at around 30 degrees, which is actually quite a few degrees cooler than the 57-inch G9, and even 2 or 3 degrees cooler than the 40-inch model. There are also built-in speakers, of course, and they are definitely there, but generally speaking, forget they exist and just invest in a good pair of speakers or, headset, or rather even a mediocre pair of speakers will, of course, perform way better than most built-in monitor speakers. And as far as energy consumption goes, it does get fairly hungry when it's been pushed, but nowhere near the 430 watts. Yes, 430 stated on their websites. I guess maybe if you plug in all the devices and charge all the devices at the maximum possible charging speeds, maybe. But yeah, generally speaking, it performs around average for energy consumption. And of course, if all else fails, having a 3-year Dell warranty is actually something to be reassured about when spending, this amount of money on a monitor. It's definitely a concern when buying from, I'd say Samsung specifically, given my interactions with them have been okay to questionable at times. Thankfully, I've not had any issues with the screen that's involved me contacting them, but you can also be pretty reassured with Dell's premium supports when you purchase one of these 52-inch Thunderbolt monitors. This gives you 24/7 supports, also advanced replacement, with Dell sending out a replacement within 2 business days, and with a 2-day commitment to repair it following their remote diagnosis. So before I talk about all of the problems about the screen, as well as some potential alternatives, I just want to make sure I'm covering off everything, and that includes answering your questions that you've posted in reply to kind of my little teaser on Instagram and TikTok. Follow, by the way, at Pete Matheson, also on YouTube Shorts. So in no particular order. So a comment here from Cookerburger. I'm curious about the resolution. I know it's 129 ppi, but does it still look crisp? I'm a bit of a pixel peeper. So when sat at a normal distance, I would say, which for me is 2 feet away, yes, the text looks really crisp. Obviously, we have compared the text fringing by shoving this macro camera up super close, but honestly, generally speaking, it's very sharp for day-to-day use. Max86BR says pixels per inch. I expect some blurring on the text because the Mac is not scaling it properly. Honestly, no blurring on the text that I can see. Max scaling has actually been pretty spot on with this monitor. There's no issues that I've seen with this monitor whatsoever. Okay, quite a few questions here from Owen. So here is another test to show the macro close up with a 32-inch LG on the right. Then 1 foot, we'll do 2 feet, and then 3 feet, so you can compare. In real use, no, not really as noticeable. I don't really think there's an answer for this one. I always get told I'm wrong in the comments. If the monitor isn't straight, then it's not straight. But to me, it looks straight. I'm not sure that helps even just a little bit. Anyway, okay, so comparing to the 40-inch Dell, it's the same, but bigger and higher resolution, and my wife tells me that big is always better, so there's that. The matte coating, I don't find that aggressive whatsoever. For the smaller 6K screens, each to their own, but I think that if you're going for a 6K 32-inch screen, you really get to the point of diminishing returns. There is just a bit of a point where you can't read anything because it's just far too small, in which case you then increase the scaling to compensate, and in which case, why even buy a 6K monitor if you're going to make everything gigantic anyway? And yes, absolutely, here you go with multiple applications. Okay, Timmy Morris, for multitasking productivity, how do you find the trade-off of horizontal screen real estate for more vertical real estate compared to the 57-inch Samsung? I think losing the width but then gaining the height has been honestly pretty challenging. I'm still trying to figure it out with some applications where I want, say, my web browser to have more vertical space, but then I have this gap underneath that I'm trying to fill it with. And to your other point of adding additional monitors, you definitely could, assuming you can connect this into your machine somehow. But if you value having speakers on your desk, you're going to need a very, very wide desk to fit everything in. Comment here from Cypher, really curious since it's great for multitasking, how it might feel running a game using the large center partition and then Chrome or Discord on the screens. Yeah, so we covered this in the video already. You can do that. You can't have the display in the middle of the screen if you want that proper 4K resolution, but there is an option there for you as well. Can I buy the monitor that is on the floor. This was the 57-inch G9 monitor, and you might have to you might have to fight someone for that. Jibster X, I'm torn between the 57-inch and the Dell 55. I think you mean the 52. Which would you recommend? I would say if you mainly game, then the Samsung. If it's productivity, then the Dell instead. Jimbo Sticks. As someone who is working from home, I imagine I have a pretty typical setup. 2 27-inch monitors, a main laptop screen, all plugged into a cow digits. My question would be, to what extent does a setup like this replace a setup like that? Pixel density, who is this actually for, and what are you paying $4,000 for? Are there any equivalent solutions? Okay, so this is a really, really great question. Unfortunately, it depends is the answer. Yes, it can totally replace a cow digit or like other docking station solution. But again, in my case, I'm still keeping the docking station for, 10 gig Ethernet and quick access to like SD and micro SD cards. Also the high resolution audio, because cow digits support like a much high bitrate resolution audio. So there's that. As far as pixel density goes, it's no retina display, but it is very, very good when sat at a regular resolution, I would say. Next up, Sky Black. Question, do you feel it's an upgrade for the G9 57-inch? In terms of productivity, this might be an upgrade. Thunderbolt is handy as also a larger resolution, but the G9 had 240 Hz and a pretty nice curve, more for gaming. Yeah, you've nailed it. Like, depending on who's buying this, it could be an upgrade. Maybe it's a side grade. I see it personally as a bit of a side grade. I'm gaining the connectivity, resolution, and image quality, but I now mostly game on a big TV with my gaming PC hooked up, so I'm capped at 144 Hz or whatever that has anyway, and I just much prefer that for gaming anyway. Kevin, desk brand Amazon. This is a Secret Lab desk. Best desk I've ever owned. Link will be down below. 2 questions from Jim. Even though you think the colors are better than the Samsung Mini LED on the floor, for a 52-inch screen like Dell, isn't a stronger curve like Samsung better for seeing what's at the outer edges of the monitor, and how accurate are those colors? So yes, I agree with this, and for me, it's less about the colors, because you can always calibrate any monitor if you're really fussy about the colors. It's more about the blooming and the haloing for me when I look at the Samsung G9, the 57-inch model versus other panel types. Locan, hello. For the first time, this non-Apple monitor caught my attention. Interesting. The question is, can you compare the quality with a MacBook Pro, or even better, a Studio display, pixel density, things like that? So I don't have a Studio display here anymore. We got rid of that, but I can compare against MacBook Pro's Retina display. So I'll show you some macro shots here. But again, when you are sat a couple of feet away, you can't honestly tell the difference between like text issues or image quality and those kind of things. I guess maybe if you're sat on a laptop because you're sat a lot closer, maybe you could tell, but it's not a huge difference. Kevin, look forward to seeing the review. I wonder what you think about the curve. The LG 52 you mentioned in the other video might have the curve needed. Yeah, I do think the LG 52-inch does have the right curve. Unfortunately, not much else, like for my specific needs. Maybe just for gaming, then that might be an option. But then I prefer the 240 Hz 45-inch LG Ultra Gear instead. Okay, last question I've got here is from Mr. Sanabria. How would you compare the differences, other than the size, to the Dell 40-inch monitor? You convinced me to buy the one last year after watching your review. Honestly, it's kind of the same, but bigger. Obviously, the new picture-by-picture mode, which is just insane, but same, but bigger. What's not to love? Okay, so... But what about the problems here? Let's talk about the problems. Now, for me, this list is honestly like getting smaller and smaller every time I review, each generation of the screens, which is really nice because it means everything's like developing. And of course, it just depends on what your specific use case is here. So for me, the 8 millisecond or 5 millisecond response times, the lack of HDR, the shallow curve, and of course, again, if you're gaming on this, then you need a pretty beefy PC to drive decent frame rates at that maximum resolution. Yes, of course, 4th gen tandem OLED, curved 6K panel would be really, really nice, but just no one seems to have figured out how to manufacture that yet. But as far as productivity goes, and like I started with, this has immediately and potentially semi-permanently become my choice as my main monitor here in the studio now, where, I spend hours being productive here, scripting, gazing at my calendar, responding to emails and, YouTube comments. It is by far the ultimate choice when it comes to productivity as far as what is currently available. Now, the point does come up of why not just use a TV? Now, this is honestly really good question here. We've actually run a TV as a monitor multiple times, very successfully, if not maybe taking it to extremes at times. And there are plenty of benefits from this. The warranty especially, which can typically last, 5-6 years or more. And pricing definitely comes into the equation. I know we haven't really touched on it in this review because prices tend to drop as time goes on. But this is a very expensive screen. But, compared to this Dell monitor, which has a truck ton more when it comes to connectivity, better pixels per inch, and much better clarity when sat directly in front of one compared to a TV. And I think if you game a bit and are mainly productive, this is still just an absolute no-brainer. Because right now, the options really are getting quite thin on the ground. Like, I do prefer numerous things about the 57-inch G9. The curve, the 0.03 millisecond response time, and 240 Hz for gaming. But I hate the haloing. I hate there's no Thunderbolt or USB-C on it. And then there are, of course, the new 4th gen tandem OLED screens from LG. But again, this year, they seem to have dropped the ball with their 52-inch 5K, 2K display, which is a VA panel, when we were all expecting, their tandem OLED panel. Perhaps running 2 of their new 39-inch curved monitors could be a contender, but until I get my hands on those new models, this will be the end game, I guess, if you call it, for now. Now, I said this before with the last Dell Thunderbolt monitor, brands have a lot to learn from this monitor. The sheer number of ports, Thunderbolts, power delivery, Ethernet, and the clean design are all things that other brands should be taking notes on here, but for some reason, they still aren't. But until next time, if you are planning to buy one of these monitors, don't forget to use the link down below to help support the channel. Also, check out the Secret Lab monitor arm. Big fan of that one. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers. Bye-bye.